Hello everyone, this is your host Philip Reiner. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on technology for global security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. For today's podcast, we are joined by our colleague Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute. We were fortunate to have another extended conversation with a renowned expert in this field, Dr. John Harvey. John is the former PDASD for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs at the Pentagon, under Secretary Ash Carter. We recently connected with Dr. Harvey to discuss the details that he presented in his paper contribution for our January workshop that was focused on global NC3. It is our pleasure to have them both here with us today. What I was interested in doing was maybe kicking it off with some conversations I've recently been having with others when it comes to nuclear command and control. Just asking you for a bit of a historical perspective and baselining of what exactly that is. So when we talk about NC2, what are we actually referring to historically and today? What are we actually looking at?
We are basically considering a system that is designed to fulfill a number of roles with regard to the potential employment of U.S. nuclear forces. And the system has the following functions. It has to clearly and unambiguously detect and characterize an attack from another state. In the past, in the Cold War, we worried a lot about Russia. Today, we worry about Russia, but other countries as well. It has to be able to detect the launch of ICBMs coming from the northern Siberian plains. It has to be able to detect the launch of submarine-launched ballistic missiles patrolling off the U.S. coasts. And it needs to be able to understand the possibility that heavy bombers with nuclear weapons are on their way to the United States, and to be able to understand and detect that and characterize it. Once an attack is detected and characterized, you have to basically get the president and his senior advisors together. This is a presidential crisis. Only the president can execute U.S. nuclear forces. And you have to provide the president with information and arrange a conference between the president and his key advisors, the Secretary of Defense, the Commander of Strategic Command, anyone else he wants on the line. This may have to be done when the president is in the White House, on a trip, or possibly in between, on travel or moving to an undisclosed site. And this makes conferencing a challenge. Once a president makes a decision as a result of meeting with his advisors, there has to be a mechanism to communicate that decision to forces and to provide a means for forces to communicate back when they've achieved their targeting objectives. And finally, the command and control system relies on planning. The United States policy is to deter nuclear war by holding at risk key assets valued by potential adversaries. And we do that in order to hold those installations at risk. You have to have plans, and plans can be pre-planned. For example, I'm going to attack this certain set of targets if the United States comes under attack. Or more likely in the future, we may have what we call adaptive planning, where there is no pre-planned option for the contingency that the president is confronted with, and he has to adaptively plan to address that contingency. All of these functions must be carried out by a system which we call nuclear command and control.
In effect, this is what you hear someone like General Hyten speaking about, which is referring to it essentially as another leg of the triad. Everyone is fairly commonly aware of the three legs of the triad, but we don't really hear a lot of conversation around essentially what brings it all together. This is what makes it all function at the end of the day. And it's an interesting piece because it seems to be overlooked often, even though if it doesn't function well, none of this comes together. I'm curious, you spoke about it as part of the deterrent, and we'll get into this piece of it as we go through the conversation. But as we think about modernization of what is essentially a 20th century architecture that was built to respond to 20th century threats, really in the dyad of the Soviet Union and the United States, as we think of modernization, how must the system that you just described that needs to be more adaptable, more flexible, how does that begin to take shape as we think about modernizing what was and what it needs to be?
Philip, you're absolutely right. The command and control system for nuclear forces is an essential component of the nuclear triad. Many of us sometimes call it the fourth leg of the triad. It has traditionally received less attention for a number of reasons. The responsibility, the acquisition oversight for various pieces of the system is split among three services, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and across the defense agency, which we call the Defense Information Systems Agency. This split acquisition makes it difficult to put together the arguments we need to be able to get priority both within the Department of Defense and with Congress on nuclear command and control. The forces themselves, the airplanes, the ICBMs, the submarine-launched missiles, the bombers, all of them have fairly active constituencies advancing their arguments in the acquisition realm, both within the Defense Department and Congress. The nuclear command and control system traditionally has not. And that's an important thing that Mr. Obama and Mr. Trump, their secretaries of defense, Ash Carter and Jim Mattis, have tried to emphasize over the last 4 or 5 years. And much needed attention is now being given to nuclear command and control. As you pointed out, the system that we have today is a legacy of the Cold War. Yeah. In fact, there are elements of the system that were put in place 30, 40 years ago. Some of it operates on vintage technologies, information technologies. It has been improved and modernized over the years. For example, satellites that detect launches have been replaced with more modern satellites. But the general architecture pretty much has remained the same. And basically, to meet the Cold War mission, which many of us viewed as a massive Russian Soviet launch of ICBMs against the United States, of nuclear forces against the United States. Today, we think about the potential for nuclear conflict a bit differently, based on things that we see taking place in Russia and elsewhere. We are concerned about the limited use of nuclear weapons as part of conventional conflict. So it may not be a massive spasm of an attack. It may be something that evolves in a fairly limited way from a conventional conflict. And this puts new demands on the nuclear command and control system. And the current system is not fully up to meeting those demands. And a modern system that we will introduce, that we intend to introduce over the next 10 to 20 years, will try to be more responsive to the demands of what we call modern conflict. And I can go into those a bit, but what has to be changed? That's a very important question too, because there are other factors that require us to think differently about command and control than we used to. Those factors are one I've mentioned, which is the propensity in Russian doctrine to contemplate the limited use of nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict. The other one is the capabilities of both Russia and other countries, China and other countries, to be able to hold at risk U.S. space systems, which the nuclear command and control critically rely on. There's a concern that we didn't have back in the 80s about the cyber vulnerability of the nuclear command and control system. And this is getting a lot of attention these days because of demonstrated capabilities by our adversaries. And so we have to ensure that our nuclear command and control is resilient to cyber attack. And that's a remarkable challenge that I can go into a little bit later on.
Yeah, I'd be very keen on actually pulling that thread a little bit. It's something that arises in a lot of our discussions. It came up in the workshop back in January. It definitely comes through in the paper that you've shared with us. It was interesting and perhaps worthy of note in a discussion we recently had with Paul Bracken and the paper that he provided for the workshop as well. He talks about the necessity for not just revisiting some of the systems that are a part of the overall NC3 enterprise, but also probably having to rethink some of the institutional arrangements, or as perhaps you put it in your paper, the key principles that undergird kind of the policy approach for said architecture. I'm curious, you began to talk about cyber, you began to talk about some of the other challenges in modern conflict. From your vantage, what institutional arrangements might perhaps need to be revisited? How would they need to be adjusted in order to have a policy in place that actually drives the systematic changes that are necessary to have that more adaptive NC3 architecture in place? Are there examples of where the key principles maybe need to be updated first?
Well, I think there are. With regard to today's command and control system, because it has been fragmented acquisition oversight, the Navy focuses on, for example, the ability of the president and his designees to communicate with the submarines that are underwater patrolling out in vast ocean regions. The Air Force has typically focused on the piece that involves communication with ICBMs or bombers. The Defense Information System Agency has focused on support to the president in regards to the types of information the president will need and the means of getting it to him in order to make decisions about nuclear employment. So this fragmentation of the system makes it difficult for us to get our arms wrapped around the whole system, particularly in such areas as cyber vulnerability. So I think one of the things that we have to understand and we have to take on is to make this acquisition approach much more integrated, to have a single organization being able to understand every piece of the system, to basically to have a systems architecture that is defined and adhered to by the various acquisition authorities, and to have a means by which disputes between the acquisition authorities, for example, in the Navy and the Air Force, being resolved in connection with getting the funds they need to implement, to execute the system. And basically, this lead belly button for nuclear command and control is going to be the commander of STRATCOM. And that's what Jim Mattis did last year at this time. He made General Hyten the belly button for nuclear command and control. So those kinds of things have to be looked at. I think another thing we have to look at is, what do we do about the large multi-purpose satellite systems that have become increasingly vulnerable? If we lost, for example, what we call an AEHF, Advanced Extremely High Frequency Satellite, we have a few of them up there. There's some redundancy in the system, but not a lot. If we lost one or two of those satellites from an ASAT attack, that would make it very difficult for us to communicate in the environments that are required in nuclear conflict. And so we may have to be rethinking our approach to a few large multi-purpose satellite systems, for example, both do tactical, general purpose military command and control, as well as nuclear command and control, and figure out ways to be able to, first of all, disentangle those specific multi-mission satellites, and to find a way to make them more survivable to the types of threats we now envision. And that may involve multi-proliferated networks, not in geosynchronous orbit, but in low Earth orbit, of many, many satellites that are small and cheap that you could replenish if they got shot down, much more easily than you could a large AEHF or a small space-based infrared system satellite that we use for launch detection. So those are some of the concepts.
John, you mentioned the AEHF satellites, which provide a lot of the global backbone for nuclear command and control, particularly the transmission of fire orders, but also thinking through and then retargeting nuclear forces. All this stuff has to go on either before or during a nuclear war, and much of it would go over satellite links. Yet today we know that the many of the ground terminals, particularly of a system, as you know, called FABT, or the family of advanced beyond line of sight terminals, at least in their R&D phase, were having great trouble actually linking with the satellites, in part because they were so loaded with million line plus code that often generated error even as the error was corrected, rather like the Windows blue screen problem that keeps on coming back. So at the moment, those advanced systems, as they're superimposed either on the legacy systems that you mentioned earlier, or even on the complementary ground systems that support them or exploit them, are not really terribly functional even now, are they?
Well, here's what's happening is that, and this is really a black mark on the acquisition system in the Department of Defense for satellite systems. It's been a black mark that's been well recognized. We've fretted over it for 4 or 5 years. We have these modern advanced EHF satellites in the air, and we don't have modern ways to exploit their full functionality. We have to rely on the backup systems that we use with some of the older systems and we don't get the full benefits of the EHF transmission capabilities. For example, some of the terminals that work with today's EHF satellite are second or third, earlier generation systems that were designed for UHF, ultra high frequency. So we are not achieving the benefits because we have not been able to integrate, latch up the terminals with the satellite systems that they talk to, and that's very, very unfortunate, because the satellite systems are extremely expensive, and we get them up there and we find out that we can't communicate them as we intended to. Because we don't have full functionality of the terminals. So your point's well taken. What do we do about that? Well, we have to do a better job integrating the various pieces of satellite communications.
Those workarounds are, okay, I guess, for regional small nuclear wars, even if they're a bit protracted, because the time is still there for decision makers to think through the consequences of use or being under attack in a specific location, maybe against an ally or even against the United States, but it's not yet all-out war. And in that sense, the systems, there are always workarounds, as you point out. But at a time of all-out nuclear war, which is what the system was and is still ultimately defined for, which will be a global war, even as you introduce these new technologies that enable you to have much more bandwidth and to maintain instantaneous connectivity between the ultimate commanders, won't they still face exactly the same or even worse of a dilemma than during the Cold War, which is that the decision time that they have is somewhere between 30 minutes, maybe 32 minutes at best, if you look at the table in your paper for all the different factors. They're going to have at most 32 minutes and possibly no time at all, depending on the kind of attack. If it's from very close offshore using submarines, you might be dead before you have time to think. In a sense, nothing has changed, and the adversaries or the potential adversaries are also layering in these new technologies, which they don't understand very well either, that will increase their speed of attack and reduce their decision-making time. It sounds like a recipe for disaster, frankly.
Well, I think that every administration that I know anything about, I've been in a few of them, presidents have always never wanted to be faced with the need to make a rapid decision to employ nuclear forces in a period of minutes after detection of an attack. And unfortunately, when you look at the threats that we faced during the Cold War and the vulnerability of our ICBM systems, because the vulnerability of our ICBM systems are the main drivers for an early launch. You want to be able to convince an adversary that you have a capability to launch forces rapidly so they can't be destroyed on the ground. And ICBMs on the ground are reasonably targetable and relatively vulnerable. And so the president retains a capability for early launch so that no adversary would ever think or could ever be assured that it would catch the U.S. forces on the ground. But that capability is an option for the president. And the president, we have to count on the possibility that he might not execute that option. He or she might not execute that option. And that means we have to have forces that are survivable in addition to ICBMs that can extract a devastating response to any major attack on the United States. And our submarines at sea do that. And so there are a couple of factors that make the decision time problem less critical today than it was during the Cold War. Back in Cold War days, we had a much larger fraction of our warheads than we do today on large, heavy, multiple warhead ICBMs. And those were an attractive target because one or two warheads could sometimes kill a missile with 10 warheads. Today, we have demerved our ICBM force, so they are much less attractive targets. Each ICBM carries no more than one warhead today, and therefore they're less attractive targets. Second of all, as we have reduced our overall force, we have increased the relative proportion of warheads in the submarine force, so that we rely less on our ICBMs than we did in the past for deterrence of being able to hold at risk enemy installations that are valued by an adversary. And so therefore, there is less pressure on a president today than there was during the Cold War to launch rapidly. I worked for Mr. Obama, but I don't know Mr. Trump as well. But Mr. Obama wanted to do things that would increase that time even further and make a rapid launch, much less pressing.
Well, those trends certainly ameliorate the pressure, at least on the American side. I'm not so sure that it has the same effect for the Russians or the Chinese, let alone, say, the North Koreans. But aren't you facing then the irony that the system as a whole, the threat system as a whole, as these different nuclear weapon states face off with each other, each side is really relying on the rationality of the top level nuclear commanders, combined with I'll call it the professional discipline and the institutional competence of their nuclear command and control and communication systems, which if the United States system is anything to go by, have enormous capacity to wreak havoc. I mean, global nuclear annihilation. Each of those systems, their commanders, their implementing nuclear weaponeers are quite confident that their own system will work if ordered to attack, but they equally don't really understand why or how their system works today, which is a bit alarming. There
are a few really, really important people in this country who understand the entire system and how it functions at a very, very intimate level, not down to the various integrated circuits, but to the basic elements of the system. And it has been built up over many decades and improved and modernized. And in building that system up and doing various fixes and various modernization of components, it's very important to keep track of what you're doing so that somebody knows what the entire system is. Because you can count on the fact that the bad guys have their best people trying to understand any chinks in the armor of our nuclear command and control system. So we have to be better than they are. We have to understand our system better than anybody else for us to have confidence that we can tell the president, yes, if you direct this execution order, it will be carried out with very, very high certainty. That's what we desire in a modern system. We worry about that problem. I myself personally am not a cyber expert. I'm not an expert on how the bad guys could get inside our system and do damage to it. But I know people who are. They are concerned, and we have to be concerned about it. And that's why, as we modernize command and control, as we modernize the system we have out there today to make it relevant to the 21st century and how conflict might evolve in the 21st century, we need to pay close attention to how the bad guys can try to disrupt us. And basically, there are two things the bad guys can do. One of them is for us to mischaracterize an attack. In other words, an attack occurs and somehow our system is blinded to it, either functionally or electronically blinded to it. Or two, some third world terrorist group wants to try to launch a U.S. nuclear weapon when there's no attack and wants to figure out a way to bypass launch control safeguards. You worry about that kind of a problem as well.
In a crisis, I mean, the forces, as you've pointed out, the American forces are awesome. We have a triad plus a fourth leg of a nuclear command and control system that has enormous force multiplying effect, makes those systems even more precise and lethal than they would be without that current capacity. But isn't the corollary of that fact of life, which induces enormous caution, or should induce enormous caution in decision makers, that it's as much a matter of intuition as it is a matter of rationality when you're staring at the barrel of an actual or about to happen, according to your early warning systems, nuclear attack. You're looking at all those 19 issues that you want to know about as the ultimate nuclear commander in a country, of course the United States. Isn't the flip side of rationality here intuition, that gut instinct? Because you're not going to have time to process 19 issues in depth, even in the best circumstances of a limited nuclear attack.
Right.
And so that suggests that the flip side of the forces has to be some form of communication with the adversary, even the worst adversary, in order to figure out what is the vocabulary, what's the signaling system using the forces? What does that really mean to a commander trapped in a particular culture inside their own bubble, for example, with attacking national technical means or nuclear communication systems? What kind of mutual learning about the past near misses or the new challenges, which we don't really know how we're going to respond to them? You've mentioned a couple. Non-state actors is certainly a crucial new challenge, but there are others. There's an element of trust in your own and confidence in your own instinct, it seems to me, that an intuition that may be missing if we don't open lines of communication, channels of communication and cooperation between the 9 nuclear command and control communication systems that we have today. So the question is, given there's currently no framework, no institutional, organizational approach to this, there's barely even contact between the military level commanders in those 9 systems, let alone heads of state or the ultimate nuclear commanders. how can they ever use their insight and intuition to effect if they've never really thought this through in any way with their partners in conflict? The key theorist of conflict, Louis Kosa, argued that conflict is always a relationship and is based on communication. If there's no communication, it's just random violence.
First of all, even during the very most tense stages of the Cold War, back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, we found a way to have a dialogue with the Russians about nuclear stuff. And as part of that dialogue, we did some things to manage the competition. We did some things to basically understand each other's, to introduce some additional transparency, not only in the forces, but in our thinking about how we thought about the use of those forces. And so there were dialogues on these sorts of things, and they were fairly extensive, and they did it when we were at each other's throats. So it's not impossible that today's toxic environment between Russia and the United States is necessarily doomed to a continuation of the basically our inability to talk to each other at all about these forces, which are still relevant to both of our security. So I would like to say that the power that President Xi in China, that Mr. Putin in Russia, that Mr. Trump in the United States have to basically destroy the world. I don't want to overstate things, but to certainly destroy each other is awesome. Since the end of the Cold War, we have tended in the United States to focus less on these sorts of things until very recently, over the last 5 or 6 years, when Russia really took steps in the international arena that caused us to think, well, maybe these forces are not going to go away for a while, as Mr. Obama had hoped, but are going to be around for much longer than we thought. And the threats are still there. So I think, the country I'm most concerned about is Russia. Particularly, we need to find a way to reestablish some kind of a dialogue with them about this stuff. Because the degree to which some of there's a big debate right now in the community. Does Russia have an explicit policy in its doctrine and its nuclear employment policy with a limited use of nuclear weapons to advance, to support its seeking objectives in a regional conflict, for example, in Europe? I mean, there's a big debate here. Many in the United States believe any use of nuclear weapons would dramatically increase the likelihood of an all-out war. Does Russia believe differently about that? Does Russia believe that nuclear war can be controlled? If so, we need to have a dialogue about that, because many of us here don't believe that. I don't want to belabor this, and this is sort of outside the scope of my paper, but what you refer to is a very important point that folks need to be thinking about.
If I could jump in there to go back to a couple of the pieces that you had alluded to earlier, John, in terms of the cyber component of this, what came out of the discussions back in January and what is highlighted, I think, in your paper, in Paul Bracken's paper and some of the other pieces as well, is as we think about modernization of what is a 20th century architecture and thinking about modern conflict and thinking about the things that you were just describing, the necessity for dialogue and what Peter was alluding to, the cyber component of this really complicates things in that at the core of it, I mean, the Russians and the Chinese, for example, they know they're at an asymmetric disadvantage, and so that they need to target the C2 infrastructure in order to have any chance in an actual conflict, in an actual crisis. And the cyber piece really plays a fundamental role in that. It's about the satellites. It's about, the ability to knock systems down, but really at the core of it, it's the ability to get inside and shut something down or make something break or just to mess with communication systems, what have you, disinformation, etc. From the time that you've spent with this in recent years as part of the discussion around modernization, can you talk a little bit about what you started to allude to in your paper as to how folks are conceptualizing an approach to this, which is to have more of an adaptive, flexible architecture that really is operating on a 24/7 basis because the threat is so pervasive. And really, at the core of it, you can't have a dialogue about it. At the very basic level of cyber offensive capabilities, for example, the moment you speak of them, they're useless. So just wanted to hear your thoughts as to how that piece of it has had an impact. And I actually have a follow on that, which makes it even a little bit more complicated. But let's maybe start with that piece.
There's a number of views out there about the cyber vulnerability of today's system. There are some who argue that because this stuff uses 1960s, 70s vintage information technology, because it was disaggregated in its acquisition approach, because it is air-gapped in certain places, it's not connected to the internet, and therefore have that kind of vulnerability, we're sort of okay. I've heard other people say that, well, we're not okay. The bad guys maybe even understand the system better than we do, and are maybe already in there watching what we're doing and trying to understand how information moves and how the system works so that they can disrupt it when they choose to. We have a third group who are saying, well, it's worse than that. Terrorist groups could get in there and bypass launch controls and cause a launch, an unintended launch of U.S. nuclear weapons. Therefore, we should take ICBMs, which are on alert right now, off alert to reduce that risk. Not only us, but every country with ICBMs. And the fourth group say, well, we don't know. So that covers the whole surface of possibilities. And in my view, that what we need to do to address this risk is to get very, very good people on board, people who have worked, for example, the cybersecurity problems at large Silicon Valley companies that have interactions with the public and are designed to deal with these things. The Googles, the Facebooks, those cyber professionals. We need to get that kind of people to come in and to help us understand, coupled with integrated acquisition approach, so that there are no pieces of the system which are sort of off to the side and are kludges as opposed to part of an integrated systems architecture. And you got to get these guys looking and understanding our system better than any adversary could ever hope to, and to be able to understand when we are under attack or under surveillance, and to be able to operate either around it or through it. And I think that's the culture that you need in thinking about cyber resilience. The Pentagon culture, typically in acquisition programs, are tell me what I need to buy to solve this problem, and I'll buy it and then I'll forget about it.
Yep.
Well, that's not the way we should be thinking about this problem today. This problem is a 24/7 problem. When you talk to the Google people, for example, they'll say, we don't worry that much about the bad guys planting malware in our system because we are changing our system so often and adapting it and evolving it that something they put in the system last week, they won't be convinced that if they ever try to execute it, that it's going to work because the system has changed.
Right.
So a moving target is one of the concepts that we need to be thinking about as we evolve command and control from the Cold War mission to the 21st century mission. By the way, that just addresses a huge, small piece of your question.
and I was going to further complicate it by asking about the introduction of current day AI techniques. In brief, respond to what you were saying. The Defense Innovation Board has been running this process on the software acquisition system, and they've come up with some great ideas. I think and to a certain degree, some of it is embodied in some of the structures that you talked about, the NLCC considering. I think the really tough thing about this is very much what you were just describing, which is it's a cultural shift that a company like Google, for example, can take failures every other second and deal with them and update and adjust as necessary. Whereas with NC3, that's a little less of a reality we can accept, not just on a practical level in terms of making sure that things work at the moment of crisis, but the deterrence signaling piece too, where if your system is inherently vulnerable, which I think we're all asserting digital systems essentially are, how does that impact deterrence thinking in terms of how an adversary really considers the threat? Does it make nation states more inclined towards certain types of risky behavior because of overconfidence or a lack of internal confidence, et cetera? I think an interesting example of what you're talking about is DARPA's engagement with the folks who develop zero trust networks like the Google spin-out BeyondCorp. They really are trying, and they're looking at election security. It's a very novel way of approaching the management of a massive infrastructure on an agile but responsive basis. What strains my ability to conceive of these things, and I'm not necessarily asking if you have the solution, but I'm interested in your thoughts, is how is that even a safe thing to apply against NC3, where you have a scenario where failure is not an option? How do you begin to conceive of something that, sure, you have to embrace the fact that it's vulnerable, but that there's an inherent tension there that I haven't been able to wrap my head around completely?
Well, I think the system can't be perfect. There's just no way. Failure is going to be part of it. And the question is to understand failure, to understand when the bad guy has caused an element of your system to go south on you, and to be able to go somewhere else to get the message out, or to provide the president with the information he needs. So part of this is different pathways to achieving some resilience to the system. I think the broader question you posed on how does this affect deterrence? Let's say we convinced Kim Jong-il that we were inside his command and control system for nuclear forces, that we would know, number one, when he decided he was going to launch, where he was going to launch his missiles, when, and that we could actually even, number one, intercept the launch order. Two, even if they launched, we had put malware in their launch control system so that the launch would be ineffective or that would fail. What if we convinced Kim Jong-il that that was the case? Well, that would make him much more risk adverse, because he would not have confidence in the deterrent that he's produced as an asymmetric response to U.S. conventional capabilities to take him out. Now, I gave you one example. You could play that different ways if you wanted. But in a certain case, if you could introduce uncertainty in an adversary that their use of nuclear weapons would be thwarted by electronic means or some means, that could strengthen deterrence or create a more risk-adverse adversary. But I mean, I'm now spinning what ifs. How that would play out in different ways with different adversaries is not so easy to suss out.
Yeah, no, it's not. And I can imagine a scenario, for example, with the Indian subcontinent, where if Pakistan, for example, were to feel insecure in its own systems because of potential vulnerabilities along those lines, that it may actually make them inclined towards more proactive first use to take advantage of all they've got, which is these battlefield nuclear weapons in the event of a real standoff with the Indians.
I think it can play a number of ways. If you lose confidence in an element of your deterrent, and basically If you lose confidence in your ability to tell forces to execute, that's a big issue. That's a big issue.
Yep.
But I want to get back to this thing where you mentioned, I mean, I think the issue of Google can accept failures, but the command and control system can't. If we understand our system well enough, if we understand the threats to it, if we can monitor the threats to it, and we can see what's going on, that's the kind of situational awareness you need to have.
Yeah.
Then you can figure out ways to operate around it. And that has to be part of the culture.
It absolutely has to be part of the culture. And that's part of what, to be totally candid, is part of what frightens me a bit, which is having spent time, and I'm not saying this is reference to Google per se, but having spent a lot of time around these companies who deal with this stuff on a day-to-day basis, they don't have a clear picture, and they don't see all of the various vulnerabilities that are within their own systems, and they are not on top of it, and they are constantly scrambling to maintain this public veneer of confidence and security, where pretty much none of them have a good holistic grasp on the problem.
Most of the guys who I talk to who really, you're talking to somebody who is not a cyber expert, but the guys I talk to that really are and understand offensive and defensive and the marriage between the two, they're also concerned.
Yeah.
I mean, they're scrambling. Okay. Because I mean, the offense guys know how good we are, for example, in offense.
That's right.
And they say, holy shit, if the bad guys can do what we can do, we're in trouble. Okay.
Yep.
That's sort of how they think about it sometimes. That's why it's important to break down the barriers between offense and defense that you referred to earlier, which is sometimes the offensive guys have a lot of clearances for various types of compartments, and the defensive guys have their same clearances for different types of compartments, but they're not in the same compartments, and therefore they can't talk to each other. When I say compartment, I mean a category of classified information that they have access to that other people don't, even if you have a secret clearance. And so what happens, you got to be able to break down the stovepipes between offense, the guys who understand how to attack other systems, and the guys who are charged with protecting our system, so that we can have the benefits of both sets of experiences in ensuring the cyber resilience of nuclear command and control.
Yeah, this goes back to the beginnings of this conversation, which your allusion to a handful of folks who really do see the entirety of the system of the NC3 enterprise, and
right,
making sure that those folks, whether they sit on the National Security Council or in the Pentagon or elsewhere within the edifice, that they have that sort of insight into covert action programs and what have you. Having some confidence that they do, it definitely will not at any point trickle down very far, just due to the nature of the programs. I think a fantastic explication of this is a book written by the journalist Kim Zetter, Countdown to Zero Day, and it talks about how Stuxnet was cobbled together over the years, and how Stuxnet was part of a much broader set of programs. And reading through that text, you can get a pretty good picture of how even the folks working on covert action programs in the cyber domain don't even know what their neighbor is working on. And those things are then put together after the fact. They don't know what they fit into. And so put that into the NC3 context, and it gets even more complicated. I wanted to pull the thread, just if we could, on the introduction of AI techniques and the conversations you've had around this as part of the modernization effort. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how the cyber piece of this is complicated and opaque and really challenging to conceive of a framework in which it actually is something that can be managed. We begin to introduce things like AI, not in the sense of turning over launch authority to a machine, but fueling all of our information processes with these neural nets that are inherently vulnerable, that are black boxes in terms of how they come up with the predictions that they do, et cetera. They're unexplainable for the most part. It's still something DARPA's working on, et cetera. Curious as to how that played into the conversations that you've been having around modernization, if at all, and your thoughts on how that might even make things more complicated in terms of management.
I'm going to be very thin on this because I'm not really in that technological regime. But I think the way that AI helps us is the ability to absorb and process large amounts of data and help us understand patterns. I'm talking now about attacks on your system. To be able to look for signatures and maybe actually even learn signatures that reflect bad guys in the system doing things that can hurt you, and informing and making it clear that the guys who are, your IT experts, you really serious folks who understand the problem and who you've convinced somehow to come work on nuclear command and control, so that this can support them in their efforts to understand the 24/7 state of the system. And I think that's where you may get there may be some role for AI to play. And let me just be crystal clear and reinforce what you said earlier, is we never want to be put in a position where the system that detects a launch, assesses it, characterizes it, and is given an automatic command and control of U.S. nuclear forces. That will never happen. There will always be people in the loop. People in the loop introduce vulnerabilities as well, insiders, for example.
Sure.
And that's why we have a fairly extensive system of safeguards to ensure against inadvertent launch. And we can go into those in some detail, but not a lot of detail.
John, the U.S. defense modernization budget for nuclear weapons is, I think it's now heading north of $70 billion a year. And of that, roughly 10%, $5 to $7 billion a year, is devoted to nuclear command and control and communications. And some fraction of that is the actual modernization. A lot of that money just goes to the maintenance of the existing systems. I think there are roughly 160 of those systems is one count that we've seen in the American system. Now, in the big picture, the triad, the three legs, the submarines, the land-based missiles, and the bombers, each have a supporting nuclear command and control system and communication system of their own. In a sense, we're running three such systems simultaneously. And there are two options for the triad in the future, in the longer, medium to long term, given, I think, that the budgetary pressures in Washington. One is what you could call the magically shrinking triad, where you keep all three legs, but just with less and less forces in each leg, each still with its own nuclear command and control system. Or you could move to a dyad, just bombers and submarines, or ultimately just to a monad, one of those two options, a bomber force or a submarine force. If you were to think about a deterrent only, not a warfighting system, which of these options do you think is best served by a nuclear command and control system in the future? Is it keeping full-blown support in all these different ways for nuclear command and control communications for all three legs, or should we be thinking about what it might look like and how radically different it would be technically and budgetarily if we were to shift to a dyad or a monad in the long run?
Well, Peter, we are in the midst of a nuclear modernization program which is intended to replace systems that are aging out of the force. And right now, the nuclear command and control piece of that actually has two things going for it. It's a lot cheaper than the delivery systems, and it has a lot of bipartisan support in Congress. So Congress is going to fund nuclear command and control, I believe, in a bipartisan way. You'll have your debates on things like the long-range standoff cruise missile, the ground-based strategic deterrent, the system designed to replace the Minuteman III ICBM. There'll be some debate on that. But I think NC3 I think there's generally bipartisan support that the president needs to have assured connectivity with forces and with his advisors. Second piece of that is, yes, if you take certain pieces of the triad away, you simplify the command and control problem to a degree. But you also complicate things by losing the benefits of a triad in terms of the way the various forces support each other in connection with what we call hedging, which is if we lose a certain component of the force through aging or through some technological breakthrough, for example, that lets submarines become transparent when they're underwater, or you can find them easily when they're underwater, that would make the ICBMs more important in helping to hedge that risk, and the bombers too, to hedge that risk. So oftentimes, those of us who are in this business sort of like the triad, but recognize that it's, no matter what you say, there's money out there that's going to be spent on it. And there'll be pressures to look at ways to manage those costs. If I were doing things, I would keep the triad and have fewer systems. I would keep the ICBMs, and instead of deploying 400, maybe 300 or 250 or something like that, as opposed to remove it from the force. My personal view. If you're talking about the system that is most survivable today, now again, that long-term survivability is not a given. The system that is most survivable today is the submarines. And I support having a greater fraction of our nuclear forces in submarines today than we have had in the past. And we can do that even as we reduce forces at some point, even beyond the 1,550 or so that we're looking at today.
So what that implies is that as the services push back on budgetary constraints on the numbers of deployed forces they would have over the coming decades, the logical trade-off would be essentially less land-based systems, land-based missiles for more NC3, because there are going to be trade-offs there, and it sounds to me like the NC3 would have the support of the other two legs plus the residual ICBM supporters, because it just makes a whole lot of sense to make the NC3 system extremely capable for everyone. Yeah, you can buy an enormous amount of NC3 for relatively few missiles.
Let me make a comment on the cost issue. It's going to cost over the next 30 years $1 trillion to sustain and modernize nuclear forces, including the command and control. $1 trillion, and that's a lot of money. But I'm going to tell you right now that it's about, maybe some would argue, 1.2 trillion. I'm not going to quibble. I'm going to tell you that's about somewhere in the range of 3 to 6% of the defense budget. We have traditionally spent 3% of the defense budget on nuclear forces on average. And when you go into modernization cycles, which we're in right now, it's going to roughly double, somewhere around that. So maybe somewhere between 3 and 6% of the defense budget. Now, Ash Carter and Jim Mattis and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs all have said, particularly in this day and age, that nuclear forces are job one for the Defense Department. So if they only cost 3 to 6% of the budget, and if they really are job one in the Defense Department, then you can afford them. And I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a fantastic place to leave this. And we really appreciate you making the time, John, out of your schedule to have this conversation with us. We wish we could continue it.
Look, it's you guys. This is really important. I appreciate what you guys do in this. And I'm really looking forward to getting some attention to this effort.
Well, thank you for your years of contributions to this field, and thanks for joining us today. We'll be back next week, everyone, with the former Vice President for Security Engineering at Google, Mr. Eric Gross. Until then, thanks everyone for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you.